Did a janitor just save a $10 million military vehicle with nothing but his hands and experience? Wait till you hear how. If you're as amazed as we are, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories like this. Hit the bell so you never miss an update. It was supposed to be an ordinary training day at the military base. The soldiers were ready, the equipment was prepped, and the engines hummed with power. But within hours of beginning the exercise, disaster struck. The new tactical combat vehicle, the pride of the base, suddenly sputtered, lost power, and a thick plume of black smoke poured from its exhaust with every attempt to restart the engine. The exercise was just hours away, and everyone was scrambling to figure out how to fix it. But nothing worked. The mechanics, fully trained on state-of-the-art equipment, began their usual procedures. They connected their diagnostic tools to the vehicle system, hoping to get a readout, to see what went wrong. Yet, all they were met with was a blank screen and error codes that didn't explain anything. They tried resetting the system, checking every cable, inspecting the engine, but still, the vehicle refused to start. A sense of panic began to spread, as the clock ticked down, and the training exercise loomed large on the horizon. In the midst of this chaos, there was someone standing quietly nearby, watching the scene unfold. To everyone else, he was just a janitor, pushing his cleaning cart as usual. His name was Hank Matthews, and though no one knew it, he had seen more military engines and vehicles than all of them combined. He had worked for decades as a mechanic in the Army, specializing in military vehicles just like the tactical combat vehicle now stranded in the yard. But today, Hank's job was to keep the base clean, mopping floors, emptying trash, and making sure the hallways were spotless. His hands, once used to wrenching bolts and adjusting engines, now only held a broom and dustpan. Yet, Hank was no stranger to problems like this one. After spending more than 30 years in the maintenance division, repairing and servicing military vehicles in multiple states, he knew these machines inside and out. He had worked on everything from basic trucks to advanced armored vehicles, and in his later years, he had even contributed to the development and maintenance of the tactical combat vehicle itself. Hank knew this vehicle. He knew exactly what was wrong with it, but no one could see it. The soldiers around the vehicle were too caught up in the advanced diagnostic systems, relying on their tablets and digital tools to fix the issue. But Hank knew better. He had spent years fixing vehicles without ever needing a screen or digital tool. It was about instinct, listening to the engine, observing how it behaved under certain conditions. And as Hank stood there, watching the team struggle, he couldn't help but notice the small details that they were missing. The little signs that no scanner could catch. The mechanics were stumped. They ran another diagnostic, tried another reset, and still, the vehicle didn't respond. Hank continued to watch from the sidelines, knowing exactly what was wrong with the engine, but he stayed silent. His role now was clear, he was just the janitor. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he couldn't just stand by and let the vehicle, and the exercise, fail because of something so simple. Hank Matthews continued to push his cleaning cart, but his thoughts were miles away from the mundane task of wiping down windows and mopping floors. The vehicle was still there, in the yard, hood up, surrounded by frustrated mechanics and engineers. He had already observed the situation for long enough to know that they were going about it all wrong. The tactical combat vehicle, an armored, all-terrain beast, designed for the rigors of battle, was not something you could just plug into a computer and expect it to fix itself. Hank had worked with machines like this for decades. When a vehicle like the tactical combat vehicle broke down, it wasn't about running codes or resetting systems, it was about understanding the mechanics, listening to the subtle signs, and knowing what worked and what didn't. And right now, the mechanics were missing those signs. He had heard the engine sputtering before, the distinct sound of a machine struggling to catch its breath. The smell of unburned diesel had hit the air before the first puff of black smoke shot from the exhaust. To anyone else, it might have seemed like an engine glitch. But Hank knew it wasn't. It wasn't the engine's fault. It wasn't a wiring problem or a bad sensor. It was simpler than that, yet far too easy to miss. Hank paused for a moment, his eyes lingering on the mechanics, who were still fiddling with their tablets and scanners. The young techs were relying on their gadgets, believing that all their answers were in the data. But Hank knew better. He had seen far too many young technicians get lost in the numbers, overlooking the physical signs that could lead to a solution. Technology was a tool, a powerful one. But it couldn't replace the experience of someone who had lived through hundreds of engine failures, someone who could hear the hum of a machine and know exactly what it needed. Just a moment, Hank muttered to himself. He wasn't going to just stand here, quietly observing. He had earned the right to speak up. He had the knowledge, the experience, and, most importantly, the skills to fix this. After all, it had always been about getting the job done, not about who did it. With a small sigh, Hank leaned the broom against the wall and walked toward the vehicle. He moved with purpose, his steps firm but unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world to make the fix. But he knew better. The exercise was only hours away, and time was running out. The vehicle had to be ready. And right now, no one seemed to understand what was wrong with it. As he approached the tactical combat vehicle, Hank saw that the mechanics were still scratching their heads. One of them, a young man in his 20s, held a tablet that was connected to the vehicle's diagnostic system. The screen showed no errors, no faults, no codes that would explain why the engine was failing to start. "What's the verdict?" Hank asked, casually stepping closer to the group of mechanics. The young technician turned to him, a look of frustration on his face. "We've got nothing. The scanner is clear. We've reset the codes, but it's still not starting. The engine just won't catch." Hank nodded. "Let me take a look." The technician gave him a confused glance, then shrugged. After all, Hank was just the janitor. What did he know about military vehicles? But Hank didn't wait for an invitation. He crouched down beside the vehicle, getting a good look at the engine's innards. The vehicle's hood was up, revealing the power-packed Duramax V8 engine. Hank's fingers twitched with familiarity. He'd worked on this engine before. He had maintained it in various settings across the country, helped develop its systems. This wasn't just any engine. This was a military vehicle engine. It had its quirks, its personality. And Hank knew its language better than anyone in this yard. He listened closely as the engine cranked again, the low sputtering sound that marked the engine's struggle to stay alive. Hank leaned in, narrowing his eyes. The engine revved, and the return hose started to shake. That was it. The telltale sign of excessive fuel pressure. The engineers and mechanics were looking at the vehicle's computer systems, but they were missing what Hank knew immediately: the problem wasn't in the electronics. It was in the fuel system. He straightened up and turned to the young techs. "It's not a diagnostic issue. The fuel pressure's too high. The relief valve on the pump is clogged. That's why the engine is flooding. The excess fuel isn't being released. It's a simple fix." The young technician looked skeptical, but Hank didn't wait for permission. "Check the return hose," he said. "It's vibrating more than it should. That's your first clue. That's not normal. That's fuel pressure getting out of control." The technician's face wrinkled in confusion. But the scanner didn't show anything. How can it be fuel pressure? Hank's voice remained calm but firm. "The scanner won't show it. The pressure spikes happen at startup, when the engine first turns over. If the relief valve is stuck, it won't throw a code. You'll need to physically check it." The other mechanic, a slightly older man, bent down with a flashlight, following Hank's instructions. Hank could see the flicker of realization in the technician's eyes when the flashlight illuminated the clogged valve. It was clear now: the fuel had been contaminated, and the valve was blocked. Fixing the problem with a mix of skepticism and respect, the mechanics followed Hank's lead. He calmly walked them through the process of cleaning the valve, using a diesel system spray to clear out the debris. He showed them how to replace the seals, how to check the system pressure, and how to ensure the valve was properly torqued before reassembling the parts. In just a few minutes, the task was done. The vehicle's engine was ready to be restarted. Bob stood back, watching the younger soldiers carefully reassemble the parts. He didn't need to stay and watch the engine start up. He knew it would work. The tactical combat vehicle would run smoothly now, and no one would suspect the janitor had done what the engineers couldn't. As the engine roared to life, the mechanics exchanged a look of awe. It was running perfectly. But Hank didn't bask in the glory. He turned around and walked back to his cleaning cart, resuming his tasks as though nothing had happened. After all, he was still just the janitor. The aftermath in the minutes that followed, the tactical combat vehicle was parked alongside the other vehicles, ready for the start of the exercise. No one mentioned Hank's role in fixing the vehicle. The soldiers simply got back to their duties, focusing on the mission ahead. It wasn't about who had fixed the problem, it was about getting the job done. But Hank knew the truth. The vehicle had been saved, and the exercise had been salvaged. And in the quiet corners of the base, a few soldiers had learned a valuable lesson, that experience, skill, and intuition could make all the difference, even when technology seemed to fail. The tactical combat vehicle hummed to life, the once stubborn engine now running as smoothly as it should have from the beginning. Hank Matthews stood a few feet away, watching the vehicle roar back into action. He didn't feel the need to linger, no satisfaction from his work needed acknowledgement. For him, it had been just another problem to solve, something he had done countless times over the years, but in a different setting. Now, it was over. The vehicle would take its place in the exercise, and Hank would continue his work, cleaning, sweeping, and maintaining the background of a place he had long known. But as Hank turned to walk back toward his cleaning cart, the sound of footsteps behind him caused him to pause. He didn't have to look to know it was Sergeant Smith. The same soldier who had watched silently as Hank had worked on the engine. "Carver," the sergeant called out, and Hank slowed his pace, the weight of the name pulling him back to the present. "The colonel wants to see you." Hank turned slowly, his hand instinctively wiping the rag over his pants. His mind wasn't racing with thoughts of recognition. He had done his job, and now he was just going back to his quiet routine. But something in the sergeant's tone made him stop. "The colonel?" Hank asked, his voice calm but carrying a hint of uncertainty. He didn't expect this. He had fixed the engine, yes, but he was just the janitor. The last thing he anticipated was a summons to meet with the colonel himself. Smith didn't elaborate but gave a brief nod. "Yeah. He's waiting. Let's go." With a small shrug, Hank followed Sergeant Smith across the base. The familiar hallways and paths were all too well known to him, the same paths he had walked for years, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't just the janitor. The steps felt heavier somehow, as if the world was seeing him in a new light. They reached the administrative building, and Hank was ushered up 2 flights of stairs before stopping in front of an office. Smith knocked on the door, and Hank stepped inside, unsure of what awaited him. The room was filled with reports and monitors, a sharp contrast to the familiar maintenance areas he was used to. "Mr. Matthews," the colonel's voice cut through the air, firm but not unkind. Colonel Kenneth Bowden stood from behind his desk and looked Hank up and down, eyes sharp but tinged with respect. "Please, come in." Hank stepped inside, staying at attention but maintaining his usual calm demeanor. He could feel the weight of the moment settling over him, but he didn't let it show. He was still just the man who had fixed the engine, no more, no less. "Sit," the colonel offered with a slight motion toward a chair across from him. "I've been told you solved a very important issue for us today." Hank sat down, his thoughts swirling. "I did what I could, sir. The JLTV needed attention, and it wasn't getting it. The colonel studied him for a long moment before speaking again. It's not just the JLTV that I'm concerned about, Matthews. It's the experience. The skill. You fixed something that our technicians, some of the best we've got, couldn't see, and you did it quickly and efficiently. The colonel paused, walking over to a cabinet in the corner of the room. Hank sat still, his mind slowly catching up with what was happening. When Bowden returned, he held a small box in his hand. He placed it on the desk and opened it slowly, revealing a small card with military insignia. This is a level 3 pass, the colonel explained. It grants access to areas on base that are usually reserved for the engineering team and specialists. I've been informed that your knowledge of military vehicles is considerable. In fact, I'd like to formally extend an offer. Hank's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't what he expected. He was just a janitor, wasn't he? From now on, the colonel continued, we'd like you to join our technical team, assisting with maintenance whenever needed. Your salary will be adjusted to reflect your new responsibilities. The words hung in the air, and Hank's mind struggled to comprehend the sudden shift. It was as if the past 30 years had compressed into a single moment, and now, he was being offered something he had long given up on, a place where his expertise was valued, not ignored. I don't know what to say, sir, Hank finally managed, his voice low and thoughtful. I've spent years working on these machines, but I thought my time was done. I'm happy to be a janitor. I didn't need anything more. The colonel looked at him, a quiet understanding in his gaze. I understand, Matthews. But the truth is, we have a shortage of people with your kind of experience. We've got modern equipment and plenty of tech, but none of it works without the know-how to operate it. You still have something to offer this team. Hank looked at the card in the colonel's hand. The level 3 pass. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had been this close to these machines, working on them, making them run. Now, at 67, he was being offered the chance to return to that world. Will I still do my regular duties? Hank asked. The colonel nodded. You can stay in your janitor role if you wish. This isn't an official promotion, just an acknowledgement of your talents. You'll be able to assist the team when needed. And, if you want, you'll help train the younger recruits. Share your knowledge. Pass it on. Hank paused. He had been doing this for years, training the new recruits, passing down the skills he had learned over his decades of service. Now, he would be able to do it formally, recognized for what he knew, rather than for his uniform or rank. How soon can I start? Hank asked, his voice steady, but a hint of pride creeping through. Colonel Bowden smiled and extended his hand. Whenever you're ready. The door's open for you, Matthews. Hank shook the colonel's hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The offer was simple, but the impact was profound. Hank knew that at 67, life wasn't over. His journey hadn't ended, it was simply starting a new chapter. As Hank left the office and returned to his cleaning cart, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He was still the same man who had spent his days working on military vehicles, keeping the base running smoothly. Now, however, he was being recognized not just for what he did, but for who he had always been. His experience and wisdom had finally found a place in the world again, and Hank knew that the path forward would be one filled with respect, recognition, and opportunity. The next morning, as usual, Hank Matthews arrived at the base just before sunrise. He was still dressed in his janitor's uniform, pushing his familiar cleaning cart through the hallways. It was routine, and Hank had always appreciated the simplicity of his tasks. But today felt different. The hallway wasn't just a hallway anymore. It was a pathway leading him to something new, a purpose he hadn't expected to find again. His steps were steadier, more deliberate. As he passed by the technical workshop, Hank paused, briefly looking inside. The workshop was full of young soldiers, hunched over engines and vehicles, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of computer screens. One of the supervisors, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a thick southern accent, noticed Hank outside. "Matthews," he called, his voice carrying through the bustling room. Hank stepped in, still holding his cleaning rag. "Morning, sir." The supervisor nodded toward a corner of the room. "Got a Humvee engine over there that's acting up. Think you can take a look at it?" For a moment, Hank didn't respond. The weight of the offer, the recognition, hung in the air. But then, with a quiet smile, Hank set down his cleaning supplies. "Sure. I'll take a look." As he moved toward the engine, the younger soldiers in the room watched him. They had heard the stories, of course, the stories of Hank's vast experience, of how he had once been the go-to expert for fixing military vehicles. But now, here he was, dressed like the janitor he had been for so many years. They watched with curiosity, a sense of respect starting to bloom in their eyes. Hank glanced at the engine before him. It was an older model, a Humvee, and it had been giving the technicians trouble for days. The younger soldiers were attempting to troubleshoot using the diagnostics, scanning the engine and testing sensors. But Hank didn't need a scanner. He knew exactly what the issue was from the moment he looked at it. The problem was with the fuel injector, clogged by rust and sediment. A common issue, but one that could easily slip through the cracks of high-tech diagnostics. "First thing you'll want to do is check the fuel lines," Hank said as he started pulling the engine apart. "If this old girl hasn't been flushed out in a while, that's probably the issue. Check the filter, too." One of the younger soldiers, a recruit named Thomas, stepped forward. He had a tablet in his hands and seemed unsure of himself. "But shouldn't we run a full diagnostic first? Maybe it's something deeper." Hank smiled. "The diagnostic tells you the symptoms, but it won't tell you the cause. This engine's been sitting for a while. I bet it's clogged." Sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to see. The recruits looked at each other, exchanging unsure glances. They were used to relying on their tablets, on technology. The idea of going back to the basics, to what Hank was suggesting, was almost foreign to them. But there was something about Hank's calm, unshakable confidence that made them listen. Hank continued his work, his hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his entire life fixing machines. He carefully removed the fuel line, cleaning it with the precision that only years of experience could provide. Slowly, as he worked, the younger soldiers gathered around, observing him with a mix of admiration and curiosity. After a few minutes, Hank wiped his hands on his pants and stood back. "All right, check the fuel pressure now." The young recruits did as instructed, and to their surprise, the engine immediately fired up, running smoother than it had in days. Thomas, the recruit who had asked the initial question, stood back, wide-eyed. That was it?" he asked, amazed. Hank nodded slowly. "Sometimes it's the small things that make all the difference. The diagnostics are great, but they can't replace experience. If you ever run into this issue again, you'll know exactly what to do." The younger recruits began to nod, their respect for Hank growing. The supervisor smiled, a knowing look on his face. "See, I told you, Matthews knows his stuff. You can learn a lot just watching him work." The recognition continues. As the morning continued, Hank settled into his new role. He wasn't just there to clean anymore. He was there to teach, to guide, and to pass on the knowledge that had been waiting to be recognized for so long. The younger soldiers started asking him questions, curious about his past and eager to learn the hands-on techniques that no tablet or diagnostic tool could offer. Hank patiently shared his wisdom, explaining techniques, troubleshooting methods, and even telling stories from his time in the army. Word about Hank's skills spread quickly. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was a mentor, a valued resource for the younger generation of soldiers who were beginning to understand the depth of his experience. More and more soldiers started seeking him out, asking him to take a look at engines, share insights on the military vehicles they worked with, or just to hear stories from the days when Hank had been a core part of the maintenance team. The young recruits, once dependent on technology, were now starting to appreciate the value of Hank's approach. They began to understand that no amount of technology or advanced tools could replace the practical knowledge gained from years of working with machines, from understanding how they worked, not just in theory, but in practice. One day, while Hank was teaching a small group about engine calibration, Sergeant Smith walked into the workshop. He had a thoughtful look on his face as he approached Hank, who was showing the recruits how to properly torque an engine bolt. "Matthews," Sergeant Smith called. Hank looked up, wiping his hands on his pants. "Sergeant," Hank said, giving him a small nod. "What can I do for you?" Smith looked around the room at the recruits who were gathered around Hank. They were listening intently, following his instructions, learning from him. Sergeant Smith smiled. "The guys are starting to get it. They're actually asking for your help. You've got them learning the old ways. Not bad for a janitor." Hank didn't respond right away. He simply shrugged. "I'm just doing my part." Sergeant Smith nodded and paused before speaking again. "The colonel's been talking about you. You're making an impact. There's talk of promoting you to a senior technical advisor. Officially. What do you think?" Hank paused. He had always been content with his role, but this was different. It wasn't about the title or the recognition. It was about the work, the teaching, and the satisfaction of knowing that his years of hard work weren't going unnoticed. He smiled faintly. "Sounds good," Hank said. "I'd be happy to help. Let me know when you need me." A new era. Hank's days of pushing a cleaning cart were over. Well, not entirely. He still carried his janitor's uniform, but now it was paired with a new title. A Level 3 technical advisor, with access to areas of the base that had once been restricted to senior engineers. Hank was no longer invisible. He was an integral part of the team, valued for the wealth of knowledge and experience he brought. The younger soldiers respected him, looked to him for guidance, and eagerly learned the techniques that couldn't be found in manuals. Hank had found his place again, not as the janitor, but as the mentor, the technician, and the teacher. He wasn't just teaching them how to fix engines. He was teaching them the importance of listening, of feeling the machines, of trusting the experience that came with years of hard work. He had found his purpose once more. As Hank worked side by side with the next generation of soldiers, he realized that his journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The following weeks saw a transformation at the base. The technical workshops that once felt like an impersonal machine shop were now abuzz with energy, not just from the usual hum of engines, but from the eager voices of young soldiers learning from Hank Matthews. His presence was felt throughout the facility, and every mechanic, from the newest recruit to the most experienced technician, sought him out for advice. The students were no longer just following instructions, they were questioning, analyzing, and diving deeper into their work. Hank had done what many thought was impossible. He had reignited the spark of curiosity and learning in the soldiers, making them think beyond the gadgets and diagnostics. Hank's influence reached far beyond just solving problems. He was shaping the future of the base's mechanics, teaching them a new way to approach the work. It wasn't just about fixing the machines, it was about understanding them, building a connection with the engines and vehicles they worked on. One afternoon, after a particularly long day of working on a fleet of Humvees, Sergeant Smith approached Hank as he was wiping his hands on a rag. Smith had a thoughtful look on his face, the kind of expression Hank had seen many times before, usually when the sergeant had a question or needed advice. "Matthews," Smith began, "I've been hearing a lot of praise from the guys. They're saying you've been a huge help to them, especially with the older equipment. You've taught them more than just how to fix things. You've shown them how to think critically and work with their hands. They're learning something they can't get from a manual." Hank smiled faintly. "It's not about what they can't get from a manual. It's about what the manual can't teach. There are things you can't see on a screen or in a guidebook. The machines, they tell you their problems, if you know how to listen. Smith nodded, impressed with Hank's response. That's exactly it. I think that's why they respect you so much. You're teaching them how to truly understand what they're working on. And it's not just the Humvees. I've heard you've been helping out with the JLTVs too. Hank gave a small shrug, as though it were no big deal. The JLTVs aren't that different from the older models. Sure, they've got all the bells and whistles, but at the core, they're still machines. Same principles apply. They just need someone to slow down and look at the bigger picture. Smith paused for a moment, thinking. You know, Matthews, the Colonel was talking to me yesterday. He's been impressed with your work. We're going to need more people like you, people who understand the machines inside and out. We've got a new batch of recruits coming in, and it's clear that you're the right person to help train them. He wants you to take the lead in the next round of technical training. Hank's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that he hadn't expected the recognition. It was the way Sergeant Smith said it. There was no hesitation in his voice. Hank was no longer the janitor. He was a mentor. A leader. His experience was no longer hidden behind a broom and a mop, it was front and center, being acknowledged by the very people he had once worked alongside. Hank took a moment to process the offer. He had never imagined himself in such a role again, especially after years of quietly accepting his position as a janitor. But the truth was undeniable. He had a lot to offer, and it wasn't going to waste. I'll do it, Hank said simply, his voice steady. I'll help train them. But only if I can work with them the same way I've been working with you. Hands-on. We'll teach them the real mechanics of these machines, not just how to punch in codes or check sensors, but how to listen and feel the machines. Smith grinned, a rare smile breaking across his face. That's exactly why I want you to lead the next session. The recruits will learn more in a week with you than they will in a month of just reading manuals. We've got a real chance here to change the way things are done. As the days passed, Hank found himself at the forefront of a new chapter for the base's technical division. The recruits, who had once relied on their digital tools and diagnostics, now looked up to him as a teacher. Hank worked closely with them, showing them the ropes. How to troubleshoot without depending on screens, how to take a step back and think critically about the work in front of them. He taught them the subtle art of diagnosing problems based on sound, vibration, and feel. One afternoon, during a training session with a group of new recruits, Hank noticed a familiar face among the group. It was Thomas, the young soldier from a few weeks ago, the one who had been skeptical about Hank's hands-on approach. Hank had seen him grow since then, and it was clear that the young recruit had begun to understand the value of experience. Hey, Matthews, Thomas called out as the group finished up their work for the day. I've been meaning to ask you something. Hank raised an eyebrow. What's that? You ever think about writing this stuff down? I mean, you've taught us more in a couple of weeks than most of the techs have in months. You've got so much knowledge about these machines. It'd be a shame if it wasn't recorded. Hank chuckled. You want me to write a book? Thomas shrugged. Maybe not a book, but something. Something the new recruits can use. So they don't miss out on what we're learning from you. Hank thought about it for a moment. It wasn't a bad idea. After all, he had spent a lifetime accumulating knowledge. But the thought of putting it into writing felt like a different kind of challenge, a challenge he was unsure of at first. Still, something about Thomas's words stuck with him. Maybe, Hank replied. Maybe I'll start jotting things down. But for now, it's about getting you all to understand it in real time. Books can wait. The impact grows as the weeks went by, Hank's role continued to evolve. His influence was felt not only in the technical workshops but throughout the base. Word had spread that Hank Matthews, the former janitor turned senior technical advisor, was one of the most valuable assets the base had. The young recruits who had once been hesitant to learn from him were now seeking him out for guidance. The respect he had earned through decades of hard work and dedication had transformed him into a leader. It wasn't just the knowledge he shared, it was the way he shared it. Hank's humble demeanor, his willingness to teach without ego, and his commitment to hands-on learning set him apart. The recruits trusted him, admired him, and most importantly, they learned from him. Even the colonel took notice. Colonel Bowden, who had once recognized Hank for his skill with machines, now saw that Hank's impact went beyond just fixing engines. Hank was shaping the future of the base, and through his work, the next generation of technicians was being molded in a way that no digital tool or diagnostic could achieve on its own. The days seemed to blur together for Hank Matthews as his role on base transformed. His usual routine of janitorial duties had long been replaced by his newfound responsibility, guiding the next generation of soldiers in military vehicle maintenance. Hank was no longer the overlooked janitor. He was a teacher, a mentor, a living testament to the value of experience and intuition in a world increasingly dominated by technology. Each day brought new challenges, but Hank never faltered. The recruits had become more and more eager to learn. They came to him with questions, with curiosity, and Hank was more than happy to share the knowledge he had accumulated over the years. His hands-on, no-nonsense approach was a stark contrast to the sterile, formulaic methods they had been taught. At first, the younger soldiers were hesitant. Many of them had grown up in an era where technology could solve any problem. They had been taught to trust their tools, their tablets, and the sophisticated diagnostics. But Hank knew better. He knew that technology could never replace the fundamental understanding of how things worked, the deep knowledge of the machines that could only be gained through years of direct interaction. And slowly, the recruits began to realize it too. They started to respect the machines for what they were, not just what they could be programmed to do. They began listening to the hum of the engines, feeling the vibrations, and understanding that sometimes, the solution wasn't in a tablet, it was in the subtle details that only a seasoned technician like Hank could spot. Hank's classroom was no longer just a workshop, it was the entire base. He worked with recruits everywhere. On vehicles, in hangars, and even in the field, diagnosing problems as they arose. His lessons weren't confined to scheduled sessions. Hank took every opportunity to teach. When a malfunction occurred, Hank would stop everything to show the soldiers how to approach the problem. It wasn't just about fixing things. It was about seeing the issue, understanding it, and coming up with a solution that made sense in the real world. One afternoon, as Hank was walking past the hangar, he was stopped by one of the younger recruits, a quiet, eager young woman named Rachel. She had been in Hank's class for a few weeks and had started asking more questions, trying to grasp Hank's method of troubleshooting. She had shown a natural aptitude for the hands-on work, but Hank could tell she was still struggling with the idea that sometimes, the solution didn't come from a screen. "Mr. Matthews," Rachel said, hesitating a little. "I've been thinking about that problem with the Humvee's injector. You said it wasn't the diagnostic. But the system still showed an error, right? How do you know when not to trust what's on the screen?" Hank looked at her, his eyes softening with approval. Rachel had been one of the ones who had struggled to grasp the practical side of things, but she had come a long way. She was beginning to think beyond the surface, beyond just following the system's instructions. "You're asking the right question," Hank said with a slow nod. "The diagnostic is a tool, Rachel. It's not the solution. It's just one piece of the puzzle. When you see an error code, yeah, it might point you in the right direction. But it's not going to tell you everything. The machines don't always speak in codes and lights. Sometimes, you've got to listen to the engine, feel the vibrations, trust what you're seeing and hearing." Rachel nodded, taking in Hank's words. "So it's like you trust the process, not just the technology." "Exactly," Hank said, his voice low and steady. "Technology is a tool, not a crutch. You've got to think critically. Know when to use the tech and when to trust your hands. When to listen. When to stop and look at the bigger picture. Rachel smiled, the understanding dawning in her eyes. I think I get it. It's about using everything together, technology, instinct, experience. That's right, Hank said, clapping her on the shoulder. And you're getting there. A growing reputation as the weeks passed, Hank's influence on the base grew. He was no longer just a mentor to the recruits, his reputation had spread to senior officers and maintenance leaders. They began to see the value of Hank's approach, not just in fixing individual vehicles, but in shaping the mindset of the soldiers who worked on them. The colonel had heard the feedback from the soldiers and other leaders about Hank's impact, and he was impressed by how much the younger recruits had learned in such a short time. One day, while Hank was walking back from the training area, he was approached by Colonel Bowden. The colonel had a serious look on his face, one that Hank recognized as the prelude to a conversation of great importance. Matthews, the colonel called as he stepped up beside him. I've been hearing a lot of positive feedback from the recruits, and frankly, I've seen it for myself. You've turned this place around. We've got soldiers who were once relying entirely on diagnostics now learning how to think for themselves. You've sparked something here. Hank didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to receiving praise. He had always been the one behind the scenes, the unsung hero fixing things without fanfare. But he couldn't deny that the satisfaction of seeing the recruits grow was enough. Thank you, sir, Hank said, keeping his tone respectful but humble. I just showed them what I know. The colonel smiled, a glint of respect in his eyes. That's exactly why I'm here. We've got a new group of recruits coming in soon. And I'd like you to lead a formal training session for them. We're going to set up a program where you can take the lead, not just on the technical aspects, but on teaching the right mindset, the mindset that can't be taught through tablets and screens. Hank's heart quickened at the mention of leading the training. He had been teaching informally for weeks, but this felt different. This was official. I'd be honored, sir, Hank replied, his voice steady. I'll do what I can. The colonel placed a hand on Hank's shoulder, his grip firm. We need more people like you, Matthews. You've brought something to this base that no technology could replicate. Your experience, your way of thinking, those are things that can't be taught from a manual. You're a leader here, whether you realize it or not. Hank nodded slowly. For the first time, he felt a sense of pride that went beyond fixing engines. It was about the future, about ensuring that the knowledge he had spent decades gathering didn't get lost in the shuffle of modern technology. A new era for the base. The next few months saw Hank take on a much more prominent role at the base. He wasn't just teaching recruits anymore, he was designing the curriculum for future technical training. His hands-on, instinctive approach had proven so effective that the colonel had decided to make it the foundation of the base's training program. Hank spent his days teaching the recruits the true art of maintenance. He led by example, showing them how to listen to the machines, how to feel their pulse and understand their language. He taught them the value of patience, the importance of methodical work, and the need to constantly learn. And perhaps most importantly, he taught them that no machine could ever replace the wisdom of experience. As Hank continued his work, he watched with satisfaction as the new recruits grew more confident in their skills. They didn't just rely on the tablets and diagnostic tools anymore. They learned to trust their instincts, and in doing so, they became better mechanics, better soldiers, and better thinkers. It had been several months since Hank Matthews had first taken the lead in the technical training program, and the results were clear. The recruits who had come through Hank's lessons were different. They approached their work with a new sense of purpose and understanding. No longer were they just soldiers following the orders of a diagnostic tool. They had learned to think critically, to trust their instincts, and to understand their machines on a deeper level. Hank had ignited something in them, something that could not be easily taught with a tablet or a scanner. It was the art of truly understanding the machinery they worked with, of connecting with it in ways that went beyond the digital. As Hank walked through the workshop one crisp morning, he could hear the hum of engines, the sound of mechanics at work, and the occasional voice calling out instructions. It felt like home to him. The bustling workshop had once been a place where he was just an observer, someone passing through, unnoticed by most. But now, he was at the heart of it. He had become more than just a mentor, he was a cornerstone of the base's technical operations. It was a quiet pride that Hank carried with him, but it was one that had been earned over decades of experience. The younger soldiers respected him, looked up to him not just for his technical knowledge, but for the humility with which he shared it. He didn't flaunt his expertise. He didn't boast about his past accomplishments. Instead, he led by example, showing the recruits what real dedication to their craft looked like. And in return, they learned. One day, as Hank was reviewing a vehicle diagnostic report, he noticed something. It was subtle, but it stood out to him, a minor error in the system diagnostics of one of the new JLTVs. It wasn't a critical failure, but it was the kind of issue that, if ignored, could eventually snowball into something bigger. Hank could sense the problem without even needing to look at the vehicle itself. It was the kind of thing he had learned to spot over decades of working with military vehicles. He walked over to one of the young recruits, Rachel, who was working on the same vehicle. She had come a long way since their first conversation, and Hank was proud of her progress. "Rachel," Hank said, his voice calm, "take a look at the diagnostic readings. You're missing something subtle." Rachel looked up, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "There's a small issue with the transmission fluid levels. It's not enough to throw a code, but it's enough to cause problems down the line. You'll want to check the pressure next." Rachel frowned slightly, her fingers hovering over the tablet. "I thought the system had flagged everything already." Hank nodded slowly. "It's a good tool, but it doesn't catch everything. Trust your instincts. If something doesn't feel right, it's usually for a reason." Rachel hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She leaned over to inspect the system's physical components, carefully checking the transmission fluid levels. A moment later, she looked up, surprised. "You were right. It's low, and the pressure is fluctuating more than it should." Hank smiled, pleased with her observation. "Good catch. That's the kind of thing that experience teaches you. Don't let technology tell you what to do. Sometimes, you need to listen to the machine itself." Rachel nodded, a look of pride on her face. "Thanks, Hank. I'll get it fixed." A new era for the base. As Hank continued to work with the recruits, his reputation spread beyond the technical team. He was no longer just the man who fixed vehicles, he had become the embodiment of everything the base valued: experience, knowledge, humility, and dedication. His story was shared among the soldiers, and many began to see him as a symbol of the base's core values. Colonel Bowden, who had watched Hank's transformation from janitor to technical advisor with increasing respect, called Hank into his office one afternoon. The colonel was sitting behind his desk, reviewing reports, but when Hank entered, he looked up with a serious expression. "Matthews," the colonel began, "I've been hearing nothing but good things from the senior officers. The recruits you've trained are performing better than expected. They're not just mechanically sound. They're thinking critically, just like you've taught them." Hank nodded but didn't speak. He was used to the praise, but it still made him feel uncomfortable. He wasn't doing it for the recognition. He was doing it because it was his job, because it mattered. But he could see the pride in the colonel's eyes. "I'm glad to hear it, sir," Hank replied, keeping his tone humble. Colonel Bowden leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "You've brought something to this base that we didn't know we needed, Matthews. Your experience, your willingness to teach, this isn't just about the vehicles. It's about building a mindset, a culture that values knowledge and experience. That's something we've been missing for a long time." Hank shifted in his seat, unsure of where this was heading. "I'm just doing what I've always done, sir. I'm happy to help however I can." Colonel Bowden smiled slightly. I think it's time we recognize that what you're doing here goes beyond just helping out. We need you to lead a new initiative. We've got some plans to start an official mentorship program, one where you can directly train recruits, share your knowledge, and continue shaping the next generation of technicians. And I want you to head it up. Hank felt a slight weight settle over him at the mention of a leadership position. It wasn't something he had ever expected, but it was an offer that made sense. He had spent his entire life learning and teaching, and now, he had the chance to formalize it in a way that could make a lasting impact. I'd be honored, sir, Hank said quietly. I'll do my best. Colonel Bowden extended his hand. I'm confident you will, Matthews. You've earned this. The legacy cemented. The mentorship program was a success from the start. Hank Matthews didn't just teach recruits how to fix vehicles, he taught them how to think, how to adapt, and how to approach problems with patience and insight. His approach was hands-on, focused on the real-world challenges that couldn't be solved by a tablet. It was a return to basics, a return to the very things that made Hank a master of his craft. As the months went by, Hank's legacy was cemented. The recruits who had been under his mentorship were excelling, and the base's operations ran more smoothly than ever. Hank didn't need to say much. His work spoke for itself. His influence was felt in every corner of the base, from the workshops to the barracks, and even in the hearts of the young soldiers he had helped shape. One evening, as Hank walked back to his quarters after another long day, he paused for a moment and looked over at the tactical combat vehicle. The one he had fixed all those months ago. The engine hummed in the distance, still running smoothly, a symbol of his quiet victory. Hank had found a new sense of purpose, not as a mechanic fixing machines, but as a mentor shaping minds. And in doing so, he had not only reclaimed his place in the world but had secured a future for the next generation of soldiers who would carry on his work long after he was gone. The story of Hank Matthews teaches us a powerful lesson about the value of experience and humility in a world that increasingly relies on technology. While digital tools and automated systems can be incredibly efficient, they can never replace the depth of knowledge gained from years of hard work and hands-on experience. Hank's journey from a janitor to a respected mentor on the base illustrates that no matter how much technology evolves, the wisdom of those who have lived through challenges and mastered their craft is irreplaceable. His story also reminds us that respect isn't something that should be taken for granted, it has to be earned through consistent dedication and the willingness to share what you know, regardless of your position. Hank's ability to teach the younger generation not just how to fix vehicles but how to think critically and listen to their intuition is a lesson that can be applied to many aspects of life. In a society that often values youth and innovation, it's important to remember that experience holds tremendous value and that those who have walked the path before us have invaluable lessons to impart. If this resonates with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you can be part of this growing community and never miss an inspiring story. Your support means a lot.